My wife asked me to go to the company couple's dinner. She said it would be important for her image, that her boss always brought his wife and she didn't want to seem out of place. She spoke as if it were just another boring office formality, the kind we swallow for love, for partnership, for being a couple. I asked if he was also bringing his wife. She hesitated. She lowered her eyes. She said no, that he was separated but always brought someone. I simply replied, then take him as your husband too, since it seems you want both. And there, in her silence, louder than any scream, I understood everything. I understood what she hadn't had the courage to say. What I'd been feeling for weeks. What had been growing inside me like a silent fire. I didn't go to the dinner. And that very night, I left. I took only the essentials. 3 shirts, a backpack, and the dignity she couldn't wrest from me. The house was left behind, with its hollow picture frames and sheets that no longer carried the scent of home. Her pillows smelled too perfumed for someone who claimed to work late. And her excuses were too clean for someone who swore there was nothing. Nothing. That damned word. Nothing, for her, was the name she gave to everything she hid. Months passed. On the outside, she continued living as if the world hadn't fallen apart. But on the inside, something within her sank. They say she tried to reach out. She tried to say she was confused. That she let herself be carried away by an unresolved need, by an admiration that turned into desire. She tried to explain what, to me, was simply inexplicable. She tried to call a mistake what, to me, was a choice. It wasn't a stumble. It was a firm, intentional step toward the abyss, dragging my love along with it. And she knew it. She knew what it meant to look into the eyes of someone who chose you for life and, even so, prefer the momentary adrenaline of new attention, of a flirtation hidden in the office, of power disguised as affection. While she wallowed in her own guilt, I was reborn. It was hard. It hurt like hell. But little by little, I began to mend the pieces of what she had broken in me. I found a new way of looking. A look that didn't look away when the phone rang, that didn't hide hastily typed smiles, that didn't lie with disguised gestures. It was a look of peace. A non-negotiable peace, after so many months at war with my own certainties. And that's when I realized that true love doesn't require vigilance. It's light, calm, without traps. It chooses you every day, even when you have every option not to. But fate, with its silent irony, still brought us together again. We met again on a random afternoon, in the middle of a city that seemed too big for unplanned encounters. She looked at me with teary eyes and apologized. She spoke of regret. Of longing. Of memories that kept her awake. She said she lost herself trying to be admired, but that she traded an entire love for crumbs. That she understood too late what she lost. And me? I believed her. I believed in regret. But I no longer believed in love. The love I felt for her was no longer there. It had died silently, on some night when I waited for her to arrive and she brought perfume from another lap. I forgave. Because forgiveness liberates. But it doesn't unite. And that's where I moved on. With the one who chose me from the start. With the one who didn't need to lose me to discover my worth. What she never knew, and perhaps never will, is what happened before dinner. Before the accusation. Before my cruel response. What she didn't see were the hours I spent in front of the mirror trying to convince myself I was overreacting. What she didn't know was that, the night before, I'd accidentally heard an audio message from him on her phone. A "good night, beautiful, dream of me," muffled by the silence of the bathroom while she brushed her teeth. I didn't confront her. I just watched. I noted the details. The rush to put away her phone. The awkward smiles. The cancelled dinners. The automatic excuses. I watched until there was no doubt. And yet, even in the face of certainty, I didn't scream. I loved in silence. I tried. I waited. I suppressed myself for a few days, hoping she would realize what she was destroying. But she didn't. Only when she lost. Only when she was alone. She tried to get her life back on track. But there are wounds that time doesn't heal, it only reveals. And when she sought help to understand why she did what she did, the answer came from a stranger in a therapy room. You didn't lose his love because you cheated on him. You lost it because you didn't prioritize him. That's what they told her. Simple. Cruel. True. And that's what hurt the most, understanding that, deep down, she never really chose me. She always had me, but she never held me with both hands. Always with one foot out, a distant look in her eyes, a doubt planted in her chest. And me? I was there. Whole. Always whole. Today, she lives between silence and memories. Between what she had and what could have been. And me? I move on. With someone who chose me without hesitation. Who doesn't compare me. Who doesn't measure me. Who doesn't trade me. I move on, with the lightness of someone who carries no remains. With the tranquility of someone who has forgiven but never turned back. And if one day she wonders what's left of us, the answer is simple, silence remains. That same silence she made when she heard my last words. A silence that screams to this day. But what she'll never know, is what I did that night, after leaving home. Because before I found new love, there was something that changed everything. Something that defined the course of my life. Something that, if she knew, might change the way she sees everything to this day. But that's a part of the story only I know. And perhaps now is the right time to tell it. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional, but inspired by real situations that show, without filters, how betrayal destroys lives, erodes trust and erases true loves. Our goal is clear, show that cheating is never worth it. Get ready now for an intense, exciting and shocking story. Take a deep breath, what's next will mess with you. They met in an almost trivial way, as so many other stories begin, but with an intensity neither of them could quite name at the time. Daniel, at 32, was a calm, methodical man, with a kindness that seemed from another era. He worked as a financial consultant and carried in his gaze the sobriety of someone who had been disappointed by many people but still believed in love as a possible project. Elisa, on the other hand, was the opposite in almost every way. A journalist, passionate about words and driven by restlessness. She spoke with her hands, with her eyes, with an urgency that enchanted and frightened at the same time. She enjoyed the light chaos of ideas and the improbability of connections. And perhaps it was precisely this difference that brought them together. While he offered stability, she brought movement. While she provoked, he anchored. And the balance, for a long time, worked. The beginning was captivating. Their first meetings were filled with good conversation, laughter that lasted into the wee hours, and that feeling that time passed too quickly when they were together. Daniel was surprised by how Elisa saw the world. She was critical, intense, curious, and, although he sometimes got lost in her many opinions, he loved the challenge of trying to understand her. Elisa, in turn, felt safe in his arms. She didn't need to perform, she didn't need to protect herself. He listened to her. And this, for a woman accustomed to talking to the whole world without ever feeling truly heard, was new. She fell in love slowly, but when she fell, it was completely. The relationship was natural. Soon they were living together. They set up a small apartment with white walls, hand-picked paintings, and a bookshelf filled with their books. They had no luxuries, but care was taken in every corner. Their routine was simple but happy. They divided Sunday mornings between the market and coffee on the balcony. At night, they took turns cooking, and on Fridays, they developed the habit of watching old movies on the couch, with cheap wine and a shared blanket. It was a discreet but complete love. A love built on small, daily decisions, listening when tired, giving in when angry, apologizing even when unsure of who was at fault. Daniel was a man who believed in the idea of home, in the vision of life together. He had been raised by parents who had been together for decades, and he held that image as a model. Elisa, as freer as she was, also shared this desire, even if she didn't know exactly how to achieve it. She harbored a silent fear of becoming predictable, of losing her own essence, of waking up one day and realizing she had given up too much of herself. And Daniel, even without fully understanding this fear, respected it. He never tried to mold her, simply offered his presence. Sometimes silently, sometimes with precise words, but always constant. Over time, she began to grow professionally. She earned space in an opinion column, began participating in events, and was invited to more important meetings. Her name circulated in circles that previously seemed distant. Daniel, though proud, also felt an unease he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't envy, nor insecurity. It was just a subtle distance that began to grow. Before, her stories were shared enthusiastically at the dinner table. Now, they often came in quick summaries, between calls. She was always in a hurry. And he, over time, stopped asking. But they still loved each other. At least, that's what they seemed to believe. The respect was still there, the affection in small gestures, the memory of everything they had built together. And even when there were silences, lost glances, or lunches where one of them forgot the other, there was always an effort to reconnect, to not let it go. After all, love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice. And they chose, every day, to continue. Elisa began to take on more demanding projects, with tight deadlines, late meetings, and, occasionally, dinners with colleagues and superiors. Daniel, though bothered by the frequency of these events, didn't question it. He knew it was her dream. He knew she had worked hard to get where she was. And, above all, he trusted her. Sometimes, he went along. Other times, he preferred not to. He said he felt out of place, that he didn't belong in that world full of rehearsed smiles and calculated words. Elisa understood, but regretted it. She missed having him around, even if only as a silent presence. The differences that once complemented them gradually began to fade into noise. Daniel was more reserved, valuing home, routine, and the predictable. Elisa yearned for the new, the unexpected. She wanted to travel, a change of scenery, to experiment. These weren't fights, they were disconnections. Tiny cracks in what once seemed solid. But nothing that signaled an end. No screams, no explicit betrayal, no lack of love. Just a slow, imperceptible drifting apart, like sand slipping through your fingers. Friends noticed the changes but didn't comment. The two still presented themselves as a well-adjusted couple. Social media showed trips, Sunday lunches, and declarations on special occasions. But those who looked closely could see the distance in Elisa's eyes in some photos, and Daniel's forced smile in others. These were small hints of what had yet to be said. But it was already felt. Even with the noise, the two kept trying. They made plans for the end of the year, talked about moving apartments, and even considered getting a dog. Elisa even commented one night that maybe they were ready for a bigger step. Daniel smiled. Not out of excitement, but out of relief. He wanted to believe it was still possible. He wanted to believe their love still had some staying power. It was around this time that the invitation to a couple's dinner at her company arrived. An elegant event, the kind that serves both networking and strengthening internal ties. Elisa mentioned it casually, saying it would be important to bring a companion, that everyone would be with their partners. Daniel listened attentively, asked who would organize it, and she replied, with some hesitation, that it would be her direct boss. She gave her name and continued explaining the details of the event, but Daniel didn't pay attention to the rest. He was caught up in that hesitation. In the way she chose her words. In the way she looked away for a second, just a second, but enough to set off a signal. He said nothing. He just agreed, said he'd think about it. And he spent the next few days trying to understand what he was feeling. There was no proof, no concrete evidence, just a feeling. A subtle distrust, the kind no one can explain logically. He watched her small gestures, the way she picked up her phone and placed it face down, the way she typed more carefully, the way she sometimes smiled while looking at the device and then quickly changed the subject. They were small signs, but Daniel, with his quiet sensitivity, noticed everything. Still, he tried to silence his thoughts. He didn't want to be unfair, didn't want to ruin what was left. He thought it was just fatigue, that she was too stressed, too busy, that everything would get better after that event. Maybe it was just a phase, one of those curveballs relationships go through before they finally fall back into place. He took a deep breath, counted to 10, and tried to maintain peace within himself. Elisa continued to rush, torn between work, social commitments, and trying to keep their connection alive. She knew Daniel was quieter, more distant. She tried to strike up conversations, organize dinners at home, plan short weekend getaways. But something between them no longer flowed as it once did. And what hurt her most was realizing he was still there, steadfast, even though he no longer understood his place. The day of the dinner approached. Elisa bought a new dress, rehearsed speeches, and prepared as if it were a grand presentation. She wanted everything to be perfect. But Daniel's unease grew. He didn't know if he wanted to go. In fact, he knew he didn't. And the idea of seeing her in that setting, surrounded by stares and compliments, made him deeply uncomfortable. Not out of jealousy, but out of a feeling he couldn't yet name, a mixture of loss and helplessness. Until the moment came when she officially invited him. They sat on the couch, and she told him the event would be on Saturday, that she hoped he would come, that it would be important to her. And it was there, in that moment, that something inside him snapped. Not out of anger. Not out of hatred. But out of a quiet clarity. He didn't shout. He simply responded. The words came calmly, firmly, definitively. And her silence, then, was louder than any argument. That same night, Daniel packed his backpack and left the home they'd built together. There was no goodbye, no explanation. Just the sound of the door closing behind him, and the beginning of an emptiness she would only understand much later. The silence between them after that night became a constant presence, as if it inhabited the empty rooms of the house that had once been so full of life. Elisa tried to go about her daily routine as if nothing had happened, as if Daniel's absence were just another space between appointments and notifications. But everything around her screamed his absence. The absence was physical, but also emotional. She began to notice the piled-up dishes, the shoes no longer in the corner of the room, the absence of that "good morning" murmured in the hallway. His clothes had disappeared from the closet, and breakfast, once shared, was now just a silence filled with scattered thoughts. Still, she didn't seek him out. Pride, confusion, perhaps fear of facing what already seemed inevitable. Deep down, she hoped time would resolve what words couldn't. But time, however wise, doesn't heal omission. It only exposes what was avoided. She started coming home later. She claimed commitments, meetings, but the truth was she didn't want to return to the void. She began frequenting new places, accepting invitations she'd previously declined, trying to fill herself externally with what was missing within. It was on one of those days, at the end of a long meeting, that her boss invited her for a glass of wine. He said he wanted to hear more about her ideas, that he admired her intelligence, her poise, the way she handled the thorniest issues. She hesitated. For a moment, the image of Daniel flashed through her mind. But she quickly pushed it away. There was no longer any connection between them. The house was already empty, the bed no longer shared warmth. And what is betrayal when the bond is already broken? She wasn't looking for romance, just company that would make her forget, even if only for a few hours, the bitter taste of doubt and guilt. The wine turned into conversation, the conversation turned into confession, the confession turned into touch. And before she knew it, she was enveloped in an embrace that didn't bring comfort, but distraction. It was a different skin, a different scent, a different story. It was new, it was exciting, but it wasn't love. It was escape. And she knew it. She knew from the first second that that gesture built nothing, only destroyed what little remained of what had once been a home. Even so, she continued. The relationship with her boss wasn't official, nor was it hidden. It was what fit into the gaps in her schedule, the silences between events, the glances exchanged in the hallways. He was attentive, seductive, experienced. And, above all, emotionally unavailable. She pretended not to notice. Pretending was easier than admitting she was losing herself even further. Meanwhile, Daniel was silently rebuilding his life. He had moved to a smaller, more modest apartment, but it was now all his. He organized his books, bought a new set of cookware, and started going to the park again on Saturday mornings. The first few weeks were hard, filled with unanswered questions, with memories that insisted on appearing in ordinary objects. A forgotten t-shirt, a scent on the pillow, a song playing on the radio. He didn't talk about his feelings with anyone. He carried his pain with the dignity of someone who knows that love doesn't guarantee permanence. He began writing short texts in old notebooks, not to publish, but to cleanse his soul. One of them read, "The pain of loss is less than the pain of being forgotten in life." As the days passed, the routine became more bearable. He met new people, reconnected with old friends, went to cafes alone, and started reading more often again. He still thought about Elisa, of course, but the thought was no longer filled with sorrow, but rather with a calm, almost resigned grief. He had accepted that he couldn't force anyone to stay. Love, for him, had always been a choice made every day. And Elisa, at some point, had stopped choosing. There was no hatred, only absence. And absence, sometimes, weighs more heavily than any fight. Elisa, for her part, was immersing herself deeper in her relationship with her boss, even without knowing if it was truly a relationship. He was kind, yes, but also distant. He paid compliments, invited her to dinner, but never talked about feelings, plans, or the future. It was as if he were always floating between the present and the convenient. Despite trying to convince herself that this was enough, she began to feel the emptiness growing. It wasn't the same. There was no real exchange. There were no roots. It was a dance of vanities, of unresolved needs. And the more she tried to fit into his life, the more she realized she was moving away from her own essence. One cloudy afternoon, she ran into an old friend at a cafe. They talked for hours, and at one point, her friend commented on Daniel. She said he seemed fine, that he was lighter, more peaceful. That he had posted a beautiful text about starting over. Elisa feigned indifference, but inside something hurt. She surreptitiously asked if he was with anyone. Her friend shrugged but said she had seen a woman with him at a restaurant, laughing, holding her hand. Elisa smiled, but her eyes trembled. She left before dessert, claiming exhaustion, and that night she cried. Not for what she lost, but for what she didn't appreciate when she had it. The following weeks were filled with inner turmoil. She began to get irritated with her boss over small things, the lack of time, the absence of genuine affection, the broken promises. In one of these moments of frustration, she asked why he never talked about his feelings, why he treated her like a spare part of his routine. He smiled disdainfully and said he'd never promised anything. That she'd known from the start that it wasn't meant to be deep. That he had no room for drama. Elisa felt the floor drop. Not because she heard that, she already knew that, but because she admitted to herself that she traded everything for this. Traded someone who listened to her for someone who ignored her. Traded presence for convenience. Love for distraction. Trying to maintain the relationship became a burden. Her boss became increasingly distant, and she, suffocated, began to lose her spark at work, her motivation for the little things. She slept poorly, ate little, and was distracted. Friends began asking if everything was okay. She said yes, but her eyes no longer lied. At home, alone, she spent hours staring at the ceiling. Sometimes she remembered Daniel making jokes in the kitchen, reading aloud, adjusting the paintings on the wall like a meticulous architect. She missed his touch, but above all, the calm he brought. His confident gaze. His comfortable silence. His love without demands. One random night, she picked up her phone and opened her last conversation with Daniel. There was nothing recent, just old messages, exchanges from the time they loved each other. She read them all, one by one. And when she reached the last one, a simple, "I'm safe, I love you," she dropped the phone to her chest and cried. She cried without strength, without resistance, like someone who knows something precious has been lost forever. And in that cry, she understood. There was nothing left to mend. She had crossed a line of no return. It was no longer just the end of a relationship. It was the end of her self-image. The betrayal, until then muffled under layers of justification, now had a face, a smell, and a name. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. And that choice now weighed like a stone on her shoulders. She wanted to call, she wanted to apologize, she wanted to say she was sorry. But no words could erase what had been done. And perhaps the worst part wasn't what she lost, but what she destroyed within herself. Awareness had finally fully dawned on her. But what she didn't yet know, what was still hidden silently on the other side of the story, was that Daniel also harbored a secret. Something that would change everything. Something she never could have imagined. And it was about to come to light. She hesitated for weeks before summoning the courage to write. She spent days staring at the blank screen, drafting sentences that she erased before even finishing. She feared the response, but even more so the silence. The message she finally sent wasn't long, nor dramatic. It was direct, a no-frills apology, with the simplicity that only true regrets carry. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I needed to say I'm sorry. I lost myself. I made bad choices. I'm sorry." When she hit send, she sat motionless on the bedroom floor, her phone in her hands as if it were a detonator about to explode. She hadn't expected a response. But it came. 2 days later, on a rainy Sunday morning, a notification appeared with the name she hadn't seen in months. The text was short, but each word felt charged with a lifetime. "If you want to talk, I'll be at the cafe on the corner at 4 p.m. If you don't come, I'll understand." She arrived first. She chose a table in the back, ordered a coffee she couldn't drink, and spent the next 20 minutes pressing her fingers against the cup. When Daniel walked in, her heart raced as if it were being ripped from her chest. He was different. Thinner, perhaps, or simply more mature. His eyes were calm, but there was none of the warmth they'd felt before. He was a different man, a man rebuilt without her. When he sat down, the silence between them was almost unbearable. She tried to smile, but couldn't. He thanked her for coming, his voice calm and unaffected. She took a deep breath and began. She spoke bluntly, as if she had lost the right to soften the words. She told him how she felt, how she'd let herself be overcome by a misunderstood neediness, how she'd confused admiration with desire, and how she'd ended up mixing it all up with a feeling of inadequacy that had nothing to do with him, but with herself. She said she'd thought professional brilliance would replace the silences at home, and that dinners laden with false praise would silence the frustrations she couldn't name. She'd said it all. And when she finished, she waited. She waited for him to interrupt her, to yell, to cry, or simply to turn away. But he just looked at her with an expression difficult to decipher. And then she spoke. "I knew." His voice was low but firm. Elisa looked at him in confusion, as if that sentence had come from an unexpected place. "I knew even before dinner. I heard the audio by chance, the one from the night before. I was in the bathroom, your phone vibrated, and it was him. I didn't follow him. I didn't make a scene. I just understood. And from that moment on, I began to say goodbye. Not to you, but to the image I had of you. Elisa stood still. Shame ran through her like a sudden chill up her spine. She tried to speak, but he continued. I could have confronted you. I could have yelled, asked questions, demanded explanations. But I didn't want to. You had already made your decision. And I knew nothing I said would change that. She looked away, biting back tears. There was something else in his tone. A serenity that came from a place beyond the pain. She murmured that she was sorry, that she regretted it. Daniel nodded, but his eyes were fixed on hers, and that was when something changed. He shifted in his chair, took a deep breath, and then said, with a calmness that chilled the room, "Do you know what I did that very night, after I left?" She shook her head, almost childishly. He then told her. I went to my mom's house. I needed a place where no one would ask me anything. The next day, I called a therapist a friend had recommended to me months before. I had never set foot in a therapist's office, but I knew that if I didn't get it out, I would carry it forever. I started therapy. At first, I only talked about you. Then I started talking about myself. I discovered things I had never seen before. Old pains, fears I had disguised as control, insecurities that made me accept less than I deserved. For the first time, I began to listen to myself. Elisa looked at him silently, as if she were seeing a version of him she'd never known. Daniel continued. After a few sessions, the therapist told me something that changed everything. She said that perhaps what hurt me most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the fact that I had put myself in a place where being betrayed seemed acceptable. And that's when I understood. I loved you so much that I slowly faded away, believing that love meant enduring everything. That it was okay to be last on the list. That just being there was enough. And I was. But you never really saw me. She tried to interrupt, but he held up his hand, asking for one more second. There was something stuck in his throat that still needed to come out. I don't hate you. I don't blame you for everything. I made mistakes too. I settled. I thought love alone was enough. That affection filled the gaps. But we didn't feed that anymore. You walked away, and I let you. I didn't fight for us. I just stayed. Waiting for you to notice. But you didn't. And when you did, it was too late. Elisa wept. His words weren't spoken in anger, but the pain in them was clear. It was the pain of someone who loved deeply and yet was left behind. She tried to touch his hand, but he gently pulled away. And then came the final blow. Do you know what struck me most during that therapy? He asked, staring into the bottom of his coffee cup. It was when she asked me why I was still so afraid of losing something that no longer existed. And I didn't know how to answer. That's when I realized I was stuck in an idea. In a project that was already over. And when I accepted that, I began to truly live. He looked at her, now with tenderness. But it was a distant tenderness, of someone who has healed their own wound and now observes the past with respect, not with longing. Elisa then asked, almost in a whisper, "Are you with someone?" Daniel took his time responding. Not out of hesitation, but out of caution. After a few seconds, he nodded. Yes. She showed up without promising anything. It was just presence. A pleasant silence. Peace. A look that chose me from the start. No games, no competition, no dispute. And I chose to stay. Elisa's face fell. Not out of jealousy. But because, in that instant, she realized there was nothing more to say. That the chance he had was in the past. And that the man who now stood before her was no longer hers, not out of pride, but because he had chosen himself first. She wanted to get up, but she didn't have the strength. Daniel gently touched her arm and said, "I forgive you, I truly do. And I hope you forgive yourself too one day." But that doesn't mean I'll come back. Forgiveness frees, but it doesn't rebuild. He got up, put on his jacket and before leaving, said the last sentence, "You lost someone who would do anything for you. And I found someone who never asked me for anything other than to be myself." And then, he left. She remained there, with the bitter taste of everything she chose, with the emptiness of a love she didn't know how to cherish, with the knowledge that the betrayal wasn't the end, but the beginning of her own ruin. And only then, alone in that cafe, did she understand that life does exact its toll. But the worst kind of toll is the one from conscience when there's nothing left to make amends. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained shrouded in heavy clouds as Elisa walked slowly down the sidewalk, her steps dragging, her coat still damp from waiting at the cafe. The streets were quiet, almost silent, as if the outside world respected the silent tragedy she carried inside. She wasn't sure where she was going, she just walked. Each step felt like a frustrated attempt to leave behind what she'd heard from Daniel, but it all clung to her skin like the scent of guilt, like an expired perfume that won't wash away. When she finally got home, she kicked off her shoes at the door, tossed her cell phone onto the couch, and let her body collapse onto the living room floor. No tears came. There was no more room to cry. Only a suffocating silence and the brutal weight of her conscience. That night, she dreamed of him. Not the Daniel of the past few months, but the one from before. The Daniel who made her laugh while he cooked, who hugged her from behind while she washed the dishes, who wrote simple notes left on the refrigerator door. In the dream, she tried to tell him she loved him, but the words wouldn't come. He would look at her and smile, but then turn away and disappear among strangers. She woke with her heart racing, sitting up in bed, sweaty and dazed. The room was dark, the air heavy, and for the first time in a long time, she wanted to scream. To scream everything she never said, everything she'd hidden from herself for so long, everything she'd ignored while pretending she was fine. For the next few days, she dragged herself through her routine like someone serving a sentence. At work, she avoided her boss, now just an uncomfortable shadow of something that no longer made sense. Their conversations were kept to a bare minimum. She watched him from afar, and everything that had once seemed interesting now disgusted her. His coldness, his ego, his indifference to what they had experienced, or pretended to experience, made her nauseous. One afternoon, he walked into the office and casually asked if she was free for an event the following week. She looked at him steadily, without hesitation, and said no. He laughed, as if in disbelief, but she held his gaze. He then shrugged and left without another word, and it was at that moment that she finally felt something inside her had shifted. It was after this that she decided to step away from the company. She took an indefinite leave of absence. She said she needed to take care of her mental health. She didn't go into details. She simply turned off the machine, put away some papers, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. She walked to a small park near her home and sat on the farthest bench. She watched the leaves falling from the trees, the light wind swaying the branches, and wondered how she'd gotten there. At what point exactly had she chosen to lose herself? Because now she understood, no one forced her to do anything. She'd had every chance to stop. But she chose to leave. She chose to feed the emptiness with shallow promises, while ignoring the only love that had ever been whole. She considered writing to Daniel again, but didn't. She knew any word now would sound like an attempt to reverse course, and there was nothing left to reverse. Their time had passed. His forgiveness was a period, not a comma. And she, as much as she wished for it, didn't deserve any more fresh starts with him. Now all she could do was try to rebuild something with what was left, herself. And that hurt. It hurt so much. On the other side of town, Daniel continued his life calmly and with composure. He had adopted a cat, something he never imagined doing. He spent his weekends cooking for two. And little by little, he had stopped measuring his steps against the past. The woman he was with now was different from Elisa, but that didn't make her better or worse. It was simply another form of love. A love that required no effort to be recognized. He was surprised by the lightness of his new routine, by the way she laughed without thinking, how she slept without a weight on her chest, how she woke without fear of the silence beside her. The wound Elisa had left in his chest hadn't completely disappeared, but now it was just a scar, visible, yet painless. One Saturday morning, as he was leaving the bookstore, he saw her across the street. Elisa was sitting alone on a bench, a notebook on her lap. She was writing. She seemed focused, but there was a suppressed sadness on her face, like someone living with a silent regret. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching. He thought about crossing the street, about greeting her, but something inside him stopped him. Not out of fear, but out of protection. He knew that chapter had already been closed. He knew that time was different now. He turned and walked away. The following week, Elisa scheduled her first therapy session. She walked in shy, nervous, but willing. She sat across from the psychologist, unsure where to begin. The words came slowly, punctuated by pauses and lost glances. She spoke of the relationship, the betrayal, the breakup. She spoke of Daniel with tears in her eyes, but without drama. She spoke with shame. When she finished, she fell silent. The therapist waited a moment, then said, "Have you forgiven yourself yet?" Elisa didn't answer right away. She looked at the floor, then out the window. Then she whispered, "I don't even know how." The therapist smiled empathetically and said, "Start by accepting that what you did doesn't define who you are. But accepting isn't forgetting. It's carrying the awareness of what you did and, even so, deciding to do things differently from now on." Those words echoed in Elisa's mind in the following days. He began writing more frequently. He returned to visiting his mother on Sundays. He read books that had been sitting on the shelf. She rediscovered the joy of cooking for herself. And on a particularly quiet night, she decided to reread some of the letters Daniel had written throughout their relationship. Not out of longing, but out of courage. "I wanted to remember what it was like to be truly loved." And as she finished, she murmured to herself, "I had everything, and I didn't see it." Some time later, she ran into Daniel's mother by chance at the door of a pharmacy. It was a brief, unexpected encounter. The woman recognized her, but her smile was suppressed. Elisa, embarrassed, tried to say something, but the woman gently interrupted her. "No need to say anything. I just hope you're okay." Elisa nodded, thanked her, and before turning around, she heard the woman add, "He's happy. Very happy. And I'm at peace with that." As she got into the car, Elisa cried. For the last time. Not because she wanted to go back. But because she understood, definitively, that losing Daniel was a turning point in her life. That love had been a rare chance, one that never comes again. And she let it slip away, not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't deal with her own shadows. A few months later, she wasn't writing just for herself anymore. She created a blog. Texts about choices, self-knowledge, mistakes, and rebuilding. She didn't name names, but anyone who read carefully would understand that everything there had come from a heart that had once broken inside. Readers grew. Messages arrived saying, "I felt this way, you wrote what I experienced." And that, somehow, healed parts of her that were still hurt. Daniel never answered. Never called again. Never came back. But one afternoon, while visiting a small bookstore, Elisa saw one of his texts in a collection of chronicles about love and overcoming. He signed with only his first name. She picked up the book, leafed through it carefully, and found the text she already knew. The one about new beginnings, about learning to love yourself after being broken. She smiled. It was the same Daniel. The same man she couldn't hold on to. She paid for the book, left the bookstore, and as she walked down the sidewalk, she knew, she would never stop remembering him. But now, she would remember him with gratitude. Because it was through the pain of losing him that she finally learned to find herself. The months passed like leaves carried by the wind, without direction, without warning, but bearing the marks of time lived. Elisa continued a process of silent reconstruction. Nothing visible at first glance, nothing that caught the attention of those who simply passed her on the street, but there was something different in her gaze, a painful serenity, a kind of calm only known to those who have hit rock bottom and had to learn to breathe there. There was no longer any rush, nor any excuses. Only the intimate commitment to not repeat the same steps that brought her to that place of absence. She still dreamed of Daniel, but the dreams changed. There was no longer the attempt to reach him, no longer the despair. He appeared as someone who had passed, who had left his mark, but who had followed his path. And these dreams, even though they still left traces upon awakening, were the reflection of a profound acceptance. She knew she had lost him. And she knew that life doesn't offer the same chances twice in the same way. She spent more time alone. Not out of fear, but by choice. She reconnected with herself on long walks, in afternoons filled with books and thoughts, in quiet cafes where she observed the lives of others with the curiosity of someone who now strived to understand them before judging. The solitude that once seemed like a punishment had become a kind of stern teacher. And she was willing to listen. She had understood that before loving someone, one must acknowledge one's own shadows. Not to deny them, but to learn to live with them without projecting them onto the other. This was the dilemma that now haunted her: how to love without destroying. How to surrender without losing one's bearings. How to trust someone when, one day, they failed the very person who trusted them with their eyes closed. Daniel, meanwhile, found himself at a different point on the same road. His heart, now at peace, had learned to walk side by side with a new story. It was a discreet relationship, without grand public gestures, but with intimate ones that rebuilt what had once been shattered. Small actions that didn't seek to make up for the past, but simply to live the present with ease and integrity. There were moments of silence that didn't bother him, there were conversations that began in the kitchen and ended on the couch, there were Sundays when no words were spoken, but the connection was clear. And most of all, there was reciprocity. Something simple, yet rare. And Daniel knew it. He had learned, through pain, to no longer negotiate his peace, to no longer beg for presence, to no longer justify emotional absences. He was now a whole man, and he would only accept someone by his side who was also willing to walk alongside him, not ahead or behind. One afternoon, while visiting a cultural center, he came across an exhibition about time. Photographs, antique objects, letters, recordings. In a dark room, he sat in front of a canvas where an artist spoke about loss and choices. Everything you abandon comes back, somehow, to ask you why, a voice said. Daniel stood there for long minutes, immersed in that phrase. He wasn't thinking directly about Elisa, but it was inevitable to associate that idea with what they had experienced. She, in a way, had returned, not to try to get back together, but to ask for explanations, to hear what she might never have dared to ask before. And he had answered. Sincerely, maturely. But now I knew that some answers are, in themselves, goodbyes. Life no longer needed open pages between them. The cycle was closed. Elisa received a proposal to write a bi-weekly column on personal and reflective topics. She accepted without hesitation. I needed to give new meaning to the words I'd previously used only for work. The first text was about forgiveness. She wrote without naming names, but anyone who knew her would understand every line. She spoke about the various ways of forgiving, the other, herself, the past, the versions she let die. At the end of the text, a sentence: forgiveness is not returning to what was. It is accepting that it will no longer be, and still, moving on in peace. The repercussion was immediate. Comments, messages, shares. And, somehow, that healed another part of her, realizing that her pain, transformed into words, could be useful to others. There was no redemption in the classic sense. She wasn't seeking applause or approval. Just a way to overflow what she had learned from her fall. It was also during this period that she chanced upon a woman who worked in the same building where she'd shared years with Daniel. She was a receptionist who was always friendly but rarely went beyond saying good morning. In that brief encounter in the elevator, the woman smiled, said she read her writing, and admired her for having the courage to expose so much. Elisa thanked her, surprised, and heard a phrase that echoed for days: "Not everyone who makes a mistake has the courage to talk about it without wanting to appear victimized." "You speak truthfully." Elisa stepped off the elevator with a lump in her throat. That was the point. She no longer wanted to be forgiven by him. She simply wanted to learn to live without having to erase what happened. Meanwhile, Daniel was organizing a short trip with his new partner. It would be just 4 days in a country house. Something simple. But for him, it was symbolic. The first trip he'd taken with someone since everything ended. And it wasn't an escape. It was a beginning. During their stay, they exchanged quiet conversations by the fire, cooked together, and read in silence. One of those nights, she asked him bluntly if he still felt anything for Elisa. He didn't lie. He said there was no longer love, but there was respect. That she had been important, but that it was a closed chapter. The woman listened, nodded, and simply said, "I don't need you to erase anyone, just be whole with me now." Daniel smiled. There, in that moment, he understood what adult love was. A love without haste, without competition with the past. A love that understood the complexity of existence. Back to her routine, Elisa received an invitation to a lecture on forgiveness and new beginnings. It was something she would have declined months ago. But now, breathing fresh air, she decided to accept. She prepared her speech carefully, avoiding any tone of confession but maintaining the vulnerability of someone speaking from her own soul. On stage, in front of dozens of strangers, she spoke about how mistaken it is to think that time heals everything. Time only heals when you decide to face it head-on. When you don't sweep the pain under the rug and choose to live the process, no matter how ugly and tiring it may be. When she finished, the audience gave her a standing ovation. But it wasn't the applause that touched her. It was a woman sitting in the front row, discreetly wiping her eyes. Elisa stepped off the stage and, for the first time in a long time, felt useful. Not fulfilled. But at peace. Time continued. The seasons changed. Life moved on, as it always does. But now there was more awareness in her steps, more delicacy in her gaze. Elisa still thought of Daniel from time to time, but not with guilt or desire. Simply as someone who was essential to her becoming who she was today. A love that didn't survive, but that taught her. And that, in itself, was precious. Daniel, for his part, continued writing. Short texts, fragments of thoughts, reflections on choices. In one of them, he wrote, "Not all love is meant to last. Some are meant to transform you." He published it and went to sleep with a sense of accomplishment. The next day, a message arrived in his inbox. It was from Elisa. Short. To the point. No requests, no longing. Just gratitude. "Thank you for being the man I needed to meet to become the woman I can be today. May life continue to be easy for you." He read it, smiled with his eyes, and didn't respond. Not out of contempt, but because it wasn't necessary. That night, for the first time in a long time, they both slept soundly, in different beds, in different cities, with lives finally taking their own course. The storm had passed. But what each of them had learned from it would remain forever. That morning, the city awoke to a clear sky and a gentle sun that filtered the shadows of the buildings on the damp asphalt. It was a Sunday without urgencies, the kind where time seems to stretch longer than necessary, as if the world wanted to give people's hearts a break. Elisa was walking through a crafts fair in a neighborhood she rarely visited. She had no specific destination. She just wanted to get out of the house, breathe fresh air, see new faces. The hum of conversation, the smell of ground coffee, and the soft sound of a distant accordion created a scene that, though simple, welcomed her. As she passed a used book stand, her eye was drawn to a copy with a worn but familiar cover. It was one of Daniel's favorite books, one he reread from time to time. She picked up the copy and leafed through it slowly, not intending to buy, but as if touching a memory that no longer hurts. And it was there, among the yellow pages, that a memory flashed through her, an old conversation, on a random day, in which he'd said that true love isn't the kind that screams, it's the kind that stays silent when the world falls apart. Elisa took a deep breath, smiled melancholy, and returned the book to the pile with the delicacy of someone returning something that no longer belongs to them. That same afternoon, Daniel and his partner were returning from a visit to the countryside, where they had spent 2 peaceful days in a secluded house surrounded by trees and silence. During the drive back, they talked about simple plans, a vegetable garden in the backyard, a new bookshelf in the living room, perhaps adopting another cat. He listened attentively, driving with one hand on the wheel and the other intertwined with hers, and realized how life can, indeed, be rebuilt from what seemed irreparable. There was a calm presence in her, a way of loving without demands, without fear. And there was a sincere desire to care, but now without the burden of losing himself in the other. They laughed at small things, and in the silences, there was only peace. Days later, Elisa received an unexpected invitation to participate in a discussion with other authors. The proposal was to discuss ways to overcome emotional distress through writing. She accepted without much thought, but when she received the guest list, Daniel's name was among them. She didn't know what to feel immediately. It had been so long since she'd seen him in person. The last time had been at the cafe, and since then, they'd been on completely separate paths, though intertwined by memories that, somehow, still reverberated. She considered refusing, but something inside her told her it wasn't a coincidence. It was a chance. Not to reconnect, not to mend, but to truly close the last remaining gap. On the day of the event, she arrived early, watched the audience form, arranged her notes, but read little. She was more concerned with maintaining self-control. When Daniel walked in, it wasn't a surprise, but her heart raced. He was exactly as she remembered, but there was a new sparkle in his eyes. A sparkle of someone who was doing well. She smiled with a subtle nod, and he returned it with a restrained, polite, yet unflappable gesture. During the discussion, they talked about loss, transformation, and the invisible marks some stories leave. Each, in their own way, was honest. They didn't mention their shared past, but it was impossible not to feel their words cut through. When the question session opened, someone in the audience, unaware of their history, asked how it's possible to forgive someone who has hurt us deeply. Elisa responded with the calm of someone who finally understood what that meant. She said that forgiveness wasn't a gift to the other, but an act of personal liberation. That only after forgiving can one look forward without carrying chains. Daniel nodded silently. That was it. At the end of the event, outside the auditorium, she approached him. She said she'd enjoyed hearing what he'd said. He thanked her. There was a new maturity between them, a natural civility that didn't force closeness, but also didn't impose distance. She commented on his lightness, how different he was, and he simply smiled and said he was now at peace. They spoke for a few minutes, exchanging cordial words, but at one point, she looked into his eyes with brutal sincerity and said, bluntly, that sometimes she still wondered what things would have been like if she'd made different choices. Daniel looked at her with the tenderness of someone who no longer feels affected, but also with the compassion of someone who knows that certain thoughts are inevitable. And he replied, firmly and sweetly at the same time, that perhaps the pain was necessary for them both to learn to be who they are today. That he held no grudges, but that he also had no room to go back. Elisa understood. It didn't hurt. It just hurt less. It was a serene ending. Without fanfare. But definitive. After that encounter, they both returned to their lives. No messages. No relapses. Only with the certainty that they had said goodbye in the most mature way possible. Elisa returned to writing more consistently. Her texts now carried nuances of overcoming, but also of empathy. She told stories of women who had made mistakes, who had lost their way, but who had the courage to look in the mirror. And she was recognized for it. She received moving messages from readers who said they found relief between the lines. This spurred her on. For the first time, she felt she could transform her downfall into a bridge for others. Daniel, on the other hand, was beginning to write a book. Nothing grand, just a personal project. He wanted to compile chronicles of the most profound lessons he'd learned in recent years. He wrote at night, after dinner, while his partner read alongside. Sometimes he'd read passages aloud, and she'd comment, laugh, and get emotional. These were simple moments, but they symbolized everything he'd sought for so long, a life that made sense. Sometimes he'd think about the journey that had brought him there. And even though he acknowledged the pain, he didn't want to erase anything. Because, ultimately, each rupture rebuilt him into a different version of himself, more aware, more whole, more honest with himself. One quiet morning, while walking through the park with his partner, they stopped to watch a street performance. A musician played the guitar and sang an old song he and Elisa used to listen to together. For a brief moment, memories came flooding back, but not with pain. Only with respect. He took the hand of the woman beside him, smiled, and they continued walking. The weight was gone. The past was now just that, past. An important chapter, but closed. That same afternoon, Elisa was visiting her mother, who showed her an old box filled with photographs, letters, and childhood memories. Among the things, she found a notebook with notes from her teenage years. Dreams, lists, desires. Rereading it, she laughed to herself. There was so much innocence, so much hope. And there, faced with that old version of herself, she realized that, despite everything, there was still time. Not to return to what was, but to build what can still be. Love, she learned, is not a straight line. It's a path full of detours. And sometimes, true love begins when you learn to walk alone. As she closed the notebook, she was overcome by an unexpected thought: she might never love anyone the way she loved Daniel. But that didn't mean she couldn't love again. Love is irreplaceable. Each person is unique, with their own characteristics, their own rhythms, their own silences. What matters is being whole when it arrives. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt whole again. Night fell slowly. The starry sky seemed gentle. There was a discreet peace in everything. Elisa returned home, made tea, lit incense, and wrote in her diary. Today, I don't miss him. I miss the me I was with him. But that version is back. And better. She closed the notebook, turned out the light, and slept in silence. In the next room, the world continued to spin. And time, with its patient wisdom, simply continued to teach. Several years had passed since their last direct contact. Life, with its uninterrupted march, had taken each of them down different paths, yet, curiously, parallel in their very essence. Elisa, after so many falls, rebuildings, and silences, now lived in a small but well-kept apartment, with wide windows through which the sun streamed in every morning without asking permission. She was a teacher in a creative writing social project for vulnerable women. Her life no longer revolved around audiences or recognition, but rather purpose. What had once been ambition was now direction. And with each story she heard from those women, each confession torn from pain-stained pages, she saw herself there, in parts, in fragments, in memories that no longer tortured her, but reminded her of who she had been and how much she had changed. One afternoon, while guiding one of her students through a text addressing guilt and forgiveness, she heard something that pierced her like a sharp blade. The girl asked, with the brutal simplicity of someone who experienced abandonment at a young age, what happens when we forgive ourselves, but the other person never knows? Elisa was silent for a moment. Then she replied, in a firm voice, that true forgiveness doesn't need to be acknowledged, because it's not a gift to those we've hurt, it's our way of not bleeding forever." The girl said nothing more, but smiled. And in that smile, she knew that, even though she had made a mistake, she was now helping to heal wounds that might never have had a chance to heal if she hadn't gone through what she herself had. Elisa never remarried. Not because she couldn't, or didn't want to, but because she learned to love her own company with a care she once devoted to pleasing others. There were men, yes, and brief experiences that left soft marks. But nothing that demanded from her what she once gave without reservation. He learned to set boundaries. He learned to say no. And above all, he learned that love isn't about self-denial. Her greatest commitment now was to her own truth. She had become someone who bore scars with dignity. And that made her beautiful in a way no makeup ever could. Daniel, however, continued his quiet and serene routine. He remained by the side of his partner, now his wife. They had a daughter, a girl with watchful eyes and an easy laugh, who completely transformed the meaning of love in his life. Her presence brought a new depth to his understanding of trust and commitment. He lived between work, writing, and weekends dedicated to family, in a modest but peaceful home. The past wasn't a ghost, but it wasn't a place he revisited often either. He was where he wanted to be, with whom he wanted to be, and that was enough. He felt no need to revisit old pains or question past decisions. The wound that had once broken him was now just a subtle reminder that he survived. One morning, while taking his daughter to school, she asked if he'd ever had another great love before her mother. Daniel thought for a moment, then answered honestly. He said yes, that there was someone he loved very much, but that not all love lasts, and not all love should last. The girl frowned, and he added, "Some loves serve to show us who we are and what we need to run from. Others teach us how to love without fear." His daughter smiled, and that closed the subject. But inside him, those words reverberated like a definitive closure. That story, now, was closed even in his subconscious. Elisa and Daniel never saw each other again. They didn't exchange any new messages, didn't try to bump into each other at events or on social media. It was as if, after all this, time had finally managed to separate them in a healthy way. But there was one last moment that still needed to happen, and it arrived unexpectedly. At a mid-sized book fair, where they were both invited on different days, the organizer mistakenly put their names on the same list for discussions about memories and reconciliations. When Elisa saw his name in the printed material, it was too late to refuse. It was no longer pain, just surprise. She smiled wryly and told herself that perhaps this was the last cycle to end. Daniel arrived shortly before the event began. She was already seated on the makeshift stage, with the audience taking their seats. When he stepped onto the stage, their eyes met. There was no tension, no discomfort. Just respect. The discussion was calm, with questions from the audience and thoughtful answers. At one point, they were both asked how they dealt with past wrong choices. Elisa answered first. She said she had made a mistake, that she had lost what she loved most because she couldn't deal with her own insecurities, and that she had spent years trying to fix something that couldn't be rebuilt, until she understood that her responsibility wasn't to save what had already been destroyed, but to learn not to repeat it. Daniel simply added that forgiveness, for him, came when he realized that holding a grudge was continuing to carry something that was no longer his. That freedom began when he stopped seeking justice and began seeking peace. The audience applauded them. But not for the spectacle, but for the raw, unarmed truth in their words. At the end, before they left the stage, they looked at each other once more. Daniel extended his hand, and Elisa shook it firmly. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a silent agreement that they had both survived. She left first. He stayed behind for a few minutes. When he left, she was no longer there. And so ended the story that had once nearly destroyed them. Because, in the end, no betrayal story is just about the betrayer. It's about those who didn't see it, who accepted too much, who ignored the signs, who tried to save what the other had already abandoned inside. It's about the pieces each person carries even after forgiving. It's about looking in the mirror years later and understanding that love, when left untended, doesn't die all at once. It fades slowly, like the lights on an empty stage after a play ends. And so, we end this story. Now, tell us, what did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar? Your opinion is very important, so leave it here in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow other stories like this, which bring deep reflections on choices, losses, and, above all, consequences. Remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys admiration, friendship, family bonds, trust, and even the self-esteem of those who were hurt. It's a silent poison that corrodes everything that's been built. And that's why, here on the channel, we make it very clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. Be true, first, to yourself. And then, to those who chose to walk by your side. Because some losses cannot be repaired, and some stories, once broken, never return to what they were.